Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I know it was a very difficult decision to join the webinar or enjoy the good weather. So today I'm going to be talking about socioeconomic factors that my group was able to discover to affect the distribution of electric vehicle charging station in New York City. And this is an effort which is generously supported by the US Department of Transportation and the C2 Smart Center here at NYU, which is a Tier 1 ERC center funded by the Department of Transportation. So basically the idea here is very simple. We started working on this important topic just about a few months ago, and we were able to process a bunch of data that help us to discover some data trends which otherwise are not observable. For example, they cannot be observed from physical model of transportation or electricity networks. And based on these data-driven results, we would like eventually to focus on how they can be internalized into decision-making tools that are being used to optimize the rollout of electric vehicle charging stations. Well, for those of you who don't know me, my group works in the area of smart electric power systems. We work on a variety of problems that concerns a broad spectrum of issues. Of course, one of the most interesting things that I work on is stochastic electricity market. It's about energy analytics for smart grids. We also work on power grid resiliency and cybersecurity. For the past 4 years, I was also working on energy transition, electrification, decarbonization, and associated justice issues, long before these topics became so popular with the current administration. Many thanks to them for doing that. And of course, I wouldn't be able to work on these topics if my group was not supported by the work of great many talents at postdoctoral and PhD and master student levels, which you can observe here. So for this project, which we internally call Equator, which stands for Equitable Access to Residential EV Charging, I'm delighted to work with a very diverse team. We have a co-investigator, Dr. Bursin Unel, who is at NYU Law. We have Anwar Khan, who is a PhD student at my research group here at Tandon. And we have Sarah Price and Sam Ekstrom, two master students working with us. Sarah is from Center for Data Science and Sam is from ECE. So the main objective of this project is to measure accessibility of existing public electric vehicle charging infrastructure using well-established social dimensions. And the reason why I'm saying well-established is because these dimensions is something that we learn from the open literature. We do care about affordability, environmental benefits, and quality of service. So when we learn how to measure accessibility using these dimensions, we will gain understanding of current imbalances that exist there from the viewpoint of fair allocation of this public resource. And we will be able to plan for what we call a just rollout of public charging stations of the future. Namely, we will be able to say where to site and size them and how to incentivize such an allocation that would be just or more just than it is right now. So the main outcome of this project, which we're going to deliver not now, but later, much later, is to have a public dashboard that would visualize and present in nearly real-time manner the metrics of interest that represent accessibility of these charging stations. And on this end, I would like to clarify two motivating points. The first point is, why do we even care about this dashboard? Well, the reason is that we observed from our own experience that public dashboards help to break ice, so to speak. What I mean by breaking ice implies that it helps not only to raise public awareness, but it also helps to stir a conversation with stakeholders towards addressing underlying issues. And as an example, here is a power outage dashboard that my group put online a while back. This is another project, not part of this project, but we basically designed this dashboard which collects information in real time about every outage in 5 boroughs of New York City. And it assigns a rating to this outage given socio-demographic profile of a particular neighborhood. Why do we do that? What we are interested here, we are trying to figure out how many electricity vulnerable people allocated within a given area. And we can go as low as a zip code resolution to figure out whether this particular outage should be prioritized. Of course, if you're talking about normal operations, 1 or 2 outages, it doesn't really matter in which order you would do because your repair capacity is far greater. But when you're talking about high impact events, especially during conditions when we experience summer heat, for example, massive outages caused by summer heat waves, which happen in New York regularly. In this case, this prioritization based on electricity vulnerability plays an important role. And we were able to engage both the city and local utility, Con Edison, into conversation onto how this needs to be scheduled and prioritized. I strongly encourage everyone to go click on this link that I have on this slide and to basically explore more what this dashboard is capable of. Just one fair disclaimer, by no means this work is over. We keep updating it. But the second motivation reason is that we want to design not just a dashboard, but the dashboard that will help us to address the 4 most important barrier for EV adoption. If you go back 10 years when President Obama was excited to announce 1 million EV challenge for the entire country, the issues that the country faced back then was related to cost of ownership, to the range anxiety, battery performance, lack of support, and perception, right? These are not the issues anymore. The charging itself is the single most important barrier that prevents people from adopting electric vehicles. And if we were to categorize these limits, we were able to identify 2 most important ones. Basically, the installation limits, which essentially sit at the nexus of electricity, transportation, and urban aesthetics concerns, right? That is a very difficult issue that needs to be solved. And our contribution towards solving this issue on the nexus of the interconnection between transportation and electricity networks. The second issue that exists out there is that proprietary limits. There are charging stations, but these charging stations, they are not for all types of electric vehicles. They are not for all users. There is a segmentation of the sector that needs to be addressed. And the third most important issue is availability and convenience. Basically, what it means is that it's availability of here and now charging. When we go to large metropolitan areas, the issue of New York City and some other large cities in the country also comes in the way because it allows only very few urban residents to have their own residential charging as an option. So from this viewpoint, right, we focus this work on addressing the critical barrier of public EV charging. So we don't want to pretend like we're the only one who realized this issue. For example, the local utility Con Edison, they're working real hard to deploy 100 curbside slots in 60 different paths around the city. This is going to be not very fast, only level 2 charging. And this charging is going to be extremely expensive. Depending on the conditions, it is estimated, not by us, that an equivalent of this charging is going to be between $3.5 and $10 per gallon. We don't want to diminish the role and the importance of this step, but this solution is not acceptable moving forward, not only because it's only very few charging stations, but also because clearly the value proposition of this charging, where it can go up to an equivalent of $10 per gallon, is simply not there, right? We are not adopting electric vehicles to pay $10 per gallon equivalent. So the way how we propose to address this issue is essentially based on 3 steps. The first step is something that I'm going to be talking today, and it's related on understanding current imbalances. So what we want to do here, we want to understand where electric vehicle charging stations are located there, and we want to be able to figure out whether there are some trends that prefer a certain group of EV users over other groups of EV users, and try to answer this question in a data-driven manner. The second step is that when we collect information about these imbalances and the metrics that matter to evaluate affordability, we will internalize this into tariff-making routines. The idea here is that in New York, as well as in the rest of the country, local public service or public utility commissions, for example, in the state of New York, it's going to be DPS, Department of Public Services. They do care about affordability. It's one of their open priorities. They do care about fair use of resources, so that if there is a routine that internalizes information about imbalances that exist right now, and there is a way to offset these imbalances, we expect that we will be heard. And finally, what we want to do is, based on the step 1 and step 2 information, we would like to design incentives to figure out how we need to expand EV charging infrastructure in a way to compensate for the current imbalances and to continue doing so as we move forward toward adopting more electric vehicles. So if I were to put the mathematical statement behind the problem that we're trying to solve in plain English, the answer would be that our goal is to measure accessibility of public electric vehicle charging stations by discovering correlations between their current locations. And you can see their current locations on the slide with green dots and the socio-demographic characteristics. Naturally, there is a vast number of socio-demographic characteristics that we got to consider. We did so, and we will only present those that appears to be statistically relevant, right? So if something is not statistically relevant, it will not be presented here. Before we move forward, I just want to say an important disclaimer that based on the literature that we prepared before we started this project, it was fairly obvious that quality of service measures would play an important role, such as wait time, availability of resources, level of charging power. But actually what we observe in New York City is that these do not vary greatly. So we observe that in terms of these characteristics, charging stations in New York, they are more or less uniform. So we discarded those from our analysis. Before we move forward, I just want to get you comfortable with the illustration that we're going to be using. And basically what you can see on the left-hand side of this slide is New York City population density per zip code area. And you can see that we do have information about roughly every zip code in the city on all 5 boroughs. There are some exceptions, for example, the JFK airport and other areas where we were not able to get accurate information, and those were eliminated from our analysis. And then we compared to the density of the charging stations. And what you can see is that, for example, for the areas which have comparable density in Manhattan, and if you follow my cursor, you will see here Upper East Side here. And for example, in Brooklyn, for example, here, right, you will have a completely different allocation of density of charging station. For example, here and here. So in that sense, what we want to do, we want to analyze this kind of correlations, not visually, but using data processing. So a few words about the data we're using. We're using demographic data, which is available to everyone. There is a little bit of discrepancy between the data and the demographic data and the charging station data, because charging station data is updated. It's 2021 data, and demographic data, it's like 2019, 2020. But we assume that the population dynamics is not as fast as the rollout of charging stations. So, and among myriads of demographic data characteristics that we could consider, median household income and its inverse poverty rate, as well as population percentage by rest for each zip code, seems to be important for our analysis, as well as highway data. Basically, highway data here implies how many highways you have within the areas of one zip code. Keep in mind that unlike the rest of the country, New York has a very high population density. So often we have a zip code being penetrated by 2, 3, 4 highways. And we're using NYSERDA recent data on EV charging station. And even looking at the distribution of the density, you can see that there are zip codes where density is far greater than elsewhere else. So we ran a bunch of city level analysis without internalizing information about zip code analysis. We just analyzed city as the single zone. And what we were able to figure out is that based on statistical properties that we can trust, the median household income and white population, percentage of the white population in the city, are positively correlated with the this binary decision on whether station is present or not, and the number of station. An interesting observation here is that if you look at these results, that the number of stations even more strongly correlated than the decision on whether station is present or not. So, for example, for the median household income, it's going to be 0.45 and 0.58. That is already bothering. Further, moving on, we were able to discover that as we look into some other demographic characteristics of the city, for example, we're looking into the Hispanic population percentage or Black population percentage, we observe that the presence and the number of charging stations available is inversely correlated. So you can see that's why negative coefficients in there. So we wanted to see this and look into this disproportion in a visually driven manner. And therefore, we were able to analyze it on the household by income and on the EV charging station allocation. And again, similar to the previous figure, you can observe that there are disproportions. So, for example, if you look at one of the most wealthiest region, right, here, Upper East Side, and then you will compare to a comparatively blurred area in here, right, you will see that there are going to be completely different allocations. That is not to say that it's that is necessarily by intent, but that's something that we would like to refine. And our way of refining, which I'm going to mention it later, is going to be related on conditional regression when we use net income as a conditional derivative. And the same statement can be made about the percentage of the white population, which you can see on the left-hand side, and the allocation of the EV charging stations, which you can see on the right-hand side. One important thing that I would like to add to this thing is that we also were very careful about counting the highways for every zip code. And from this viewpoint, one of the most important things that we were able to do here is to find that allocation of highways is very important. It has a positive correlation, but it's less strongly correlated than, say, net income and race. The reason for that is very simple, that we are focusing not on industrial charging for industrial facilities. We're focusing on residential public charging for residents, for citizens of New York. So from this perspective, having several highways as part of the predictor model is useful, but it's not a deciding factor. So allocation of highways does not introduce, or at least does not point directly to existing imbalances. And these are a little bit more refined analysis of what I just presented, which are summarized in this table. And essentially what this table demonstrates, it shows how different features that we have in this column in here can be used as a predictor of the electric vehicle charging allocation right now. So the first thing that I would like to point out to is that the legend is as follows. Green means it's a good predictor. Orange means it's an okay predictor. And the red means it's a bad predictor. So from this viewpoint, I'd like to say that bad, good, and okay are based on a combination of the p-value, which you have in the last column in here, and on the t value. So in this particular case, just a brief reminder that when p-value is fairly small, it means it's a good statistical hypothesis was made, so we can deem this result statistically significant. So in this case, the three best performing analyses that we were able to run are the median income, percentage of the white population, and number of the highways present. Not the binary decision, but the number. So from this viewpoint, for our further analysis, when we look at this data, we realized an important thing, that in order for us to proceed further, because in some zip codes we were not able to get significant results, we gotta have to think about grouping rather than segmentation. And therefore, we've broken down the population into the group of whites and into the group of non-whites. In this case, we were able to get statistically significant results simply because the non-white group was populated by representatives of other categories, other features, and that made it representative. So what we did, we ran this conditional analysis, and we basically were able to separate results for 64K, above 64K, and 64K of net income, or 64K and below of the net income. As you can see, this divider, 64K, is a clear positive and negative divider between the correlations. So for example, take a look at the left-hand side diagram, where on the vertical axis, you have the number of EV stations available. And on the horizontal axis, you have the percentage of zip code population identifying as white. What you can see here is that the yellow dot, the orange dots represent the median income, and the blue dots represent the median income above 64K. So basically what you can see is that as percentage of the white population increase, we are capable of observing the increasing trend into the EV stations. On the other hand, when you have a fairly low net income below 64K, you can see that from this viewpoint, it remains more or less uniform and it does not go above 10 stations per zip code. Naturally, the same statistically significant results can be obtained for the reverse case, which statistically speaking is the same thing. It just helps in certain situations to provide intuition that when we replace the horizontal axis from the white to non-white percentage of population, we see the reverse trend, right? The less non-white percentage in a given zip code area, the more electric vehicles you can see. So in this case, what we took out of it is that for any kind of data-driven analysis, out of myriads of good available and potential predictors of accessibility of EV charging stations, we do find that in terms of New York, the net income, white versus non-white population percentages, and highway presence appears to be a very strong, very good performing predictors, which have statistical interpretations that can be relevant. So now the next step for our project is to effectively think how we can internalize these predictors into multi-criteria tariff making routine so that we can identify which incentives can be used to enable EV charging rollout in a way that would take into account these existing disparities. We understand that this needs to be implemented in a way that is business friendly, so that we need to take into account business models that the current EV charging stations are using. And we were working with understanding what these business models are, though not everything is clear, because in some cases they use volumetric models. For example, when the model, when they basically make money on selling electricity to electric vehicle chargers. But in other cases, the model is more complex. They sell information. They also say potential information to the utility, and they try to monetize data available. So in these cases, it's a broader conversation that we will need to have. So I would like to stop here and to summarize after this summary. And I just want to say that when we move toward more a discussion part of this presentation, I would be interested to explore all opportunities for engaging with all relevant stakeholders. That can be fellow researchers, of course. I'm open to your criticism. I would like to, or suggestions, who knows. I'm open to work with municipalities and charging companies because I think these are key stakeholders in this game to play because they are the ones that will be in charge of developing this infrastructure. Utilities and energy collective communities, because in many cases, they lead the effort to deploy this infrastructure. It's just the ability to scale this deployment is something that bothers me. Or NGOs, in particular, those NGOs that do care about environmental justice for urban communities. And one thing that I want to make clear is that despite the fact that I'm based in New York, it doesn't mean that my interests stop there. I'll be happy to work with other areas, because very similar analysis to what we have here we're currently carrying out for a few more large cities in America, because we want to see whether these data-driven trends that we observe here, they are specific to New York, or they can be viewed as more general for the country. And just to kick off the conversation, if in addition to whatever feedback you would like to provide, and which I will gratefully accept, I would like to pose some questions that currently the team struggles with. We wonder whether charging business models internalize justice in a certain extent. We understand that these are for-profit entities, but we also would like to learn more on whether it's possible to figure out how their business models can be more fair, in a sense, more accommodating of the diversity in population that we observe in the city. We are also interested in understanding in the data needs. So if there is a willingness among industry stakeholders to shift toward justice-serving business models, we would like to learn more about what kind of data they would like to have and what kind of data they're currently lacking. And as incentives are confirmed, right, we would like to see what kind of incentives from the municipal, state, or federal level these business practitioners need in order to promote justice in their business models. So with that being said, I think I would like to stop here. I would like to thank my collaborators, and I would like to open a conversation.